involved obviously in the firearms industry in Australia before moving here to the United States. As a bit of background, where were you born in Australia?
I was actually born in Adelaide on April the 6th, 1923. My parents lived down in a suburb in Adelaide called Theberton. We moved to Kimber when I was 1 year old. Kimber was a brand new township at the end of a new railway that they built from Port Lincoln, and we were at the end of the railway. It was a great opportunity to get into a go-go new town, and we were one of the first people to get there, and he started a little barber shop. By the time I was of school-going age, I went to school there for 8 years, in the top 3 always in the grades, but the school only had 8 grades, so that's where I ran out of gas. Of course, at Kimber, kangaroo hunting was a very popular sport, and the kangaroos, really were 2 miles outside of the township, right? And my friends and I would go out, spotlighting kangaroos, once a week, I guess, and we did it with 22s. Well, I just turned 14, I guess, when I left the Kimber school. I realized that by that time that there wasn't a tremendous amount of potential in Kimber unless you owned a farm or you owned a business, and I was very ambitious and was eager to find a way of competing with the people that were successful there. I went to work for a carpenter when I left school, and I spent his name was Laurie Kaiser, and he was a very energetic, fast, rough house construction guy, and he would build a house from the foundation up to the plumbing. I had in 3 years there gained an enormous amount of experience. I quit my job with Kaiser and got a job with the local carrier that ran a truck service between Adelaide and Kimber, and for 1 year I drove a truck, big semi-trailer, 2 trips a week, and that was a very interesting deal and gave me a lot of experience and got me away from home, of course, and I was really interested in that job mainly to get myself to Adelaide and find a job there. 17, and but big experience for a young fellow that age, and I had a ton of responsibility, which was very good for me, and went on long trips delivering petrol out to the stations from Port Augusta out to Kingunya. But I finally landed a job at the British Tube Mills, and it was a very new enterprise at the time, and the war had just started then. Went to live with an old lady friend who boarded me, and so my job was to go around the whole plant from one end to the other and monitor the furnaces and take readings on the temperatures and the timing and all that sort of stuff. So I got a very good grounding in metallurgy and heat treat there, but the job of touring the factory to where all these furnaces were located gave me a wonderful opportunity to really observe the whole manufacturing process, but not only just making the tubing, but also to do all the manipulation and finishing operations, turning it from tubing into product, which was extremely interesting to me, and that's where I first really got the idea I'd loved to be a manufacturing man. I really enjoyed myself in that plant. Well, when I was at the British Tube Mills, of course, the first objective I had was to get my high school diploma. So I went to the School of Mines. And at the same time, I was very interested in learning to be a welder. And so I did a very comprehensive welding course and became a certified welder. I was offered a job through a family friend who, with a company motor company in Adelaide, Arrow Motor Company, whose owners manufactured gas producers for putting on cars to run cars on charcoal. I got this welding job at like twice as much money I was earning at the tube mills. Even though I loved the job at the tube mills, I was very ambitious. And having spent all this time to become a certified welder, I appreciated getting that opportunity. I really hadn't thought about making firearms at all at that point. Before I'd left Kimber, you know, I was very ambitious, and I had made up my mind the moment I had enough knowledge and was capable of doing it, I was going to start my own business. I figured that the way to succeed in getting a buck or two in your pocket was to have your own business. So at age 14, I'd made a pretty irrevocable decision to have my own business. Probably the end of 1945. A friend of mine who worked with me at Arrow Motors, his name was Kevin Kosh. He was a very capable mechanical guy too, and a very capable welder. He was very eager to get out and do something on his own also, so we teamed up, and we decided we'd quit the job and we would start. So we had to come up with the product, of course. So we decided to make some tubular steel tricycles. And from the knowledge that I had gained at the tube mills in manipulating tubing and then of course being able to weld it and so forth, we started making tubular bicycles, little tricycles, tubular frame, and we bought the wheels from a pram manufacturer in Adelaide and started a little business which we call Koch and Warne Limited. K-O-C-H, Kevin Koch, and Jack Warne started making these tricycles. We rented a little space in an old building in Angus Street, and we had this primitive little place. We set up. We made our own tube bending equipment and so forth, and we had our own welding equipment, so we made these very nice little tricycles. And of course after the war you could sell anything you could make. The shops just didn't have anything to sell, so even though these were a bit primitive, they were very saleable. And then searching for new products, we once again, using steel tubing, we made a Daisy type air gun, a very cheap kid's toy air gun. And we've made tens of thousands of those too. But that was limited somewhat by the availability of the slugs you needed for them. So then we decided to build some equipment and make the slugs. We had a guy that was a scrap metal merchant down on the Port Road who used to buy old car batteries, and we had him melt the car batteries down and make them into slabs of about 3 feet long and 1/4 inch thick. Then we'd roll that down in the little rolling mill we made, and then we'd stamp out these slugs. So that helped the airgun sales. So it became a business where we had probably 50 or 60 people working for us, Kosh and Warne Limited. And that, turned into a quite successful enterprise. We became a fairly good customer of the British tube mills. And the sales manager of the rubber mills was a guy named Jack O'Flaherty. And he was a wonderful, extroverted Irishman, and he was the salesman that called on us and sold us this rubber. So we got to know him very well. He was a firearm nut. He was a real enthusiastic firearm guy. Took Kevin Kosh and I on these shooting expeditions, and I got very interested in firearms. Then, of course, O'Flaherty was into converting Lee Enfield 303s into 303 high-velocity 22s. And, of course, that was absolutely dynamite on killing kangaroos. And O'Flaherty had one of these that really intrigued me. And through O'Flaherty I got to know two other fellows that were into this reloading 303 cases. The first one was Ray Cully. Ray was reloading ammunition, and he called his reloaded ammunition Sprinter. So O'Flaherty would buy Sprinter ammunition for his 303 22. And of course the material you make a 22 barrel out of, is very much softer and easier to machine than the stuff you make a high velocity 303, for instance, out of. And of course those barrels didn't last any time at all. You'd shoot them for 3 months and you'd need a new one. And at that time I also got to know another very enterprising guy, Sid Churches, and he was manufacturing the projectiles. Little hand presses in a very simple little shop making these projectiles, and of course the demand for them was enormous. So Sid Churches was making the projectile and Ray Cully was doing the loading, and Jack O'Flaherty was intriguing me with the firearms industry, and he said, boy, there's a tremendous demand for these 303 22 barrels. Surely somebody ought to make them. And Kosh and I said, boy, they can't be that hard to make. They can't be that hard to make. And we could see the demand for them, Everybody was trying to scrounge an old 22 to get the barrel. Little did I know that the reloading business was starting over here too in the United States, where people were starting to look for primers and look for projectiles and what have you, and the big ammunition manufacturers were very reluctant to sell components because it's hurt the sales of their ammunition. So I shopped around, and we knew that they made them at Lithgow Small Arms Factory, and I needed to get into the Lithgow Small Arms Factory to see how they made them. And if I could get a really good look at it a couple of times, I thought, surely, God, I could do that. But we had a bluing plant for bluing the air guns. The local agent that supplied the bluing salts, the solution for the bluing process, also supplied the bluing solutions for the Lithgow Small Arms Factory. So their big cheese came over from Sydney, and he toured around Adelaide, and of course he came to see us because we were bluing thousands of these little air guns. We sold them for peanuts, but the bluing, I guess we were the biggest customer for bluing solution in Adelaide by far. So we said, we really like to be making, we said to this guy, and we really like to be making rifle barrels. I said, we would love to get into the Lithgow small arms factory, and I know you fellas supply them with bluing solution. What's the chances of getting us into the Lithgow small arms factory? He said, oh, no trouble at all. He said, I got real good friends up there. He said, as a matter of fact, when I go up to visit, I stay in the home of the foreman that's in charge of the barrel shop at Lithgow. Oh, I thought that was wonderful. He said, well, if you come over to Sydney, and I'll take you up to Lithgow, and we'll spend a couple of days up there, and we'll get you connected with this guy, and I'm sure he'll show you how to do it and what have you. Kosh and I fired up our car, it was Kosh's car by the way this time, and we steamed over to Sydney, and then Paul Stewart was the owner of a company in Sydney called Steel Improvement Company, and Paul took us in his very fancy big Buick up to Lithgow, introduced us to this guy that was the foreman. I just don't remember his name anymore, but oh, he treated us like your long lost. And we were a couple of kids, we were 24 years old, so 25 years old by this time, I guess. And he said, well, come to the factory, and we spent the whole day there, and we looked at the tooling, and we said, where do you buy the tooling from? Oh, he said, you can't buy the tooling, you got to make it. So we came away with the drawings for the three components: the barrel drills to punch a hole through the middle of the barrel, and the reamers, and the rifling cutters. They used the Pratt & Whitney hook cutter rifling system that had been in operation for probably 80 years. We came home and said, I'll bet you we can make rifle barrels. By this time the Kosh and Warne business was throwing off a little cash, so we had the resources to at least set up the initial equipment. One of the ammunition plants that had been closed in Adelaide, they made 25-pound howitzer ammunition there, and they had these lathes, for these old lathes. Well, they were not that old, but they had been in this ammunition plant. I forget the name of the plant. It was down near Port Adelaide somewhere. Hendon, yes. And they sold them, they auctioned them for a song. So we bought them from a second-hand dealer that had bought them for next to nothing. We got them for next to nothing also. So these machines were not very complicated. Once you had a good lathe bed with a lead screw on it that would give you the carriage movement and so forth, so it was not that difficult for a couple of guys that could weld properly. We were really good welders. Fabricate the necessary changes to the machinery out of steel plate. So first we built a drilling machine, and a deep hole drilling machine, and that required a big 20 horsepower motor with a hydraulic pump on it to pump the chips out of the bore and so forth. So we had a fair bit of investment, but Kosh and Warne was generating cash fast enough to do that. We hired a couple of experienced tool and die makers, and in the pictures you showed us just a couple of days ago, I showed you one of them was the guy that really manufactured built the Pratt & Whitney hook cutter system for doing the rifling, and he just did a beautiful job, and he worked for us for many years. But we ran into all kinds of troubles. First of all, we started drilling the barrels, and the drill had come out the side halfway down. So we'd get in the car and race over to Lithgow and wine and dine our friend, get into the plant and find out why the drills are coming out the side. And they would show us what happens and how we do it. We'd come racing back. And then, you know, we got to the rifling, and we got to the stage where, you know, we were pulling the rifling heads off of the tube that you pull them with. And we just, you know, the rifling cutters were failing very badly. How can we fix it? We experimented for weeks, couldn't do it. Back to Lithgow, and oh, that's what you do. You know, come back, make the modification, got it going. And eventually we had, you know, a totally foolproof rifle. Primitive but foolproof and capable of producing very good barrels. That was a fairly profitable enterprise without, you know, an enormous investment. And it took about 30 minutes to rifle a barrel. But the machines did two at a time, so I guess that when we really got it rolling properly, we could make probably 4 an hour. We eventually saturated the market with them, and then that, of course, interested in making, you know, we had surplus barrel making capacity, so we thought, well, why not make a rifle? You know, we got the capability of making the barrel. You know, the rest of the stuff simple. Not to, the barrier, of course, in making rifles is a technology for making the barrels, and not too many people know how to do it. Not too. We were game as can be. We had nothing to lose, and we were risk takers. So it was a fun exercise for us. And you can imagine how thrilling it was to have successfully built the machinery and made these things successfully, and then be commercially successful with it. But we had one big windfall that really made it successful. The army, no, the public schools had a very important training program for the young graduates. They had the old pre-World War I Martini Henry 310 caliber cadet rifles, and they were owned by the public schools, and they had 40,000 of them, so they called tenders for them. And I had gotten to know a family that was one of the old money founders of South Australia, the Angus family, and I became very friendly with old Ronald Angus, who was the patriarch of the family. He said, I'll tell you what I'll do, I'll put up the money and you bid on the rifles. And so I bid 50 cents each for them. And I won the bid. And so I had these beautiful, hardly used, they were two English manufacturers made in England. They had half of them were BSA and half of them were Westby Richards manufacturer. Really high, beautiful quality. So the idea was to convert them to single-shot 22s and single-shot Hornets. They're all located in a central warehouse in Sydney. So we brought a truckload of them, big semi-trailer loads. But before I got delivery of them, one of the guys that had bid for them was one of the big arms dealers in Los Angeles, Golden State Arms. And he lost out on the bid, and he wanted them bad. And I wasn't interested in selling very many of them. But he made me an offer, not 50 cents, but $5 each for half of them. So put the money up front, wired the money over to Adelaide. I packed and I half of them are already packed in shippable boxes, shipped them to. And of course that gave us a lot of working capital to then develop the rifle line. And we started by doing a little single shot, which was very much a copy of the little French rifle that my father had when I lived in Kimber. I didn't know anything about rifle design at all then, but then I started buying all the books, studying it properly and subscribing to all the magazines and so forth, and I got to know a fair bit about rifles fairly quickly. But there was a limited demand. Lithgow were making the one for Slazenger's, and ours was not quite as good as theirs. But to do it, we had to make the stocks too. And how do they make those complicated shapes? So we call up our friend at Lithgow and say, hey, we want to make a rifle now, we want to come and have a look at how you make the stocks. Hills Hoist said to me, we'll give you so much money for the business. Well, it was a lot of money. So I said to the guy that owned Hills Hoist, I said, look, I'm interested in selling the company, but only if I can, the part of the deal is that Koch takes his money, but also I'll buy him out, with the money I get, I'll buy him out of Sporting Arms. So it was quite a bit of money that was very attractive to Koch. And so as part of that deal, I got Koch out of the picture on a fairly friendly basis because I bought him out of Sporting Arms as well. I could see the potential, and I met Bill Langman, and this is a very important part of the development of Sporting Arms. And you know, I'd got to know Ron Angus, and Ron Angus was probably the richest guy in South Australia. And Langman got to know Ron Angus. Langman was the chief financial officer at TSI, Tubular Steel Industries, that made chromium-plated tubular furniture. They were on Dawes Road, and they had a big plant, and they were a public company. And Ron Angus had put up a lot of money for them also, but it was a public company, he bought a lot of stock. Ron had put a bit of money into my business just to give me a hand, you know. Ron said to me, he said, you need a really good financial guy because you need a lot more capital in this business to make it go. You know, you're doing all right, but you know, it's chicken feed. If you want to really make this go, you need some capital. And he said, you need a good financial guy to keep the books and help you on the financial side because you are an engineer and a practical factory guy and what have you, and marketing, and you were interested in that, but you needed somebody with a lot more experience financially. But he said Langman is unhappy there because the CEO is a fellow with a huge, great big ego. So I met Bill and got to know him a little bit, and he showed him the plan, and he was intrigued that we were doing this high-tech stuff with homemade equipment. He just couldn't believe that you could make rifle barrels. Anyway, he agreed to come. We'll give you a piece of the company, and you can pay at such and such a price, like a stock option, and then he paid for it over time, or he got bonuses that paid for it over time. And he really was 180-degree opposite to me. He couldn't turn a wrench. He didn't know which side was up in a factory. He didn't know a lathe from a milling machine, but he was a whiz kid financially. And then Langman knew some of the other investors, old money investors, that put some money into Sporting Arms and gave us an opportunity to have a little capital. Langman was financial only, a very good public relations guy, but really wonderful partner and very good with the money. And you know, it's nice for a CEO not to have to worry about the money too, you know. I didn't have the contacts, nor did I have the experience in the financial side. But we had, and then when we got mixed up with OMAC, they had a very very up-to-date system, and we adopted their system. Langman took to it like a duck to water. And Langman was a very important contributor to OMARC also, even after I got. He took my place after I left there. But we weren't public. We were not public. So we sold the Koch and Warne business and the tube mill, which was pennies from heaven for them, to Hills Hoist, got cash for it, and those of us who got the cash, I spent some buying out Koch, the other bit I put into Sporting Arms. We had outside money, but we weren't public, and I had a controlling interest. I started to work on modifying it, to put the box magazine and change the trigger mechanism and change the firing pin and a few other things that really made the Sportco automatic better than anything on the market in the United States. It was a very reliable 22. That made that a very, very profitable and very, very go-go product. And you know, and then the next model was that we used a lot of the component parts. The barrel was identical, the tube diameter and the bolt diameter and the extractor claws and safety catch and all that sort of stuff was identical to the automatic, that we made a bolt action. So for every 5 rifles we sold, 1 was a bolt action and 4 were automatics. Koch and Warne was in Angus Street in a part of Simpson's old building. And that's where we started Sporting Arms. And then of course the two businesses were incompatible. One was tube bending and rolling, big rolling machines and dirty, and the other one was a machine shop, and it needed to look like a machine shop, you know, it needed to be clean, and you were doing very precise work. And we were out of space. Simpsons didn't have any more space. So by this time I had enough money to buy a building. And Freeman Motors had this building down there. You had it for a workshop, and we bought it. It was a very good buy. We put all the rifle barrel stuff in there, so we were, and it was only just big enough. We filled it up with our machinery, and we had probably 30 people working in it. And we ran out of space, and we had enough money to build the plant to pay the deposit on a loan to build the plant down at Clovelly Park. And that was a pretty nice plant. Then we had plenty of space, and that's when we had the chance to buy a lot of machinery from Lithgow. The Lithgow small arms factory were making, during World War II, Lee Enfields, Browning machine gun barrels. They weren't making the Browning machine gun, that was made by somebody else, but they made the barrels at Lithgow, and they were doing the Schlesinger rifle after the war, and the government said, hey, Lee Enfield rifles are out, we're going to make the FN automatic. And they said at this time all this old World War I machinery is out of date, we're going to strip the plant and we're going to buy all new American machines. So there was a big auction sale. So we went over and we bought barrel drilling machines, reaming machines, rifling machines, and a lot of milling machines. They had hundreds and hundreds of the same milling machines, because it takes it, you know, all the rifle parts are milled. So we bought them for next to nothing, you know. For $100 we bought a $5,000 deep hole drilling machine and so forth. I bought 3 truckloads of machines and put them into this new plant at Clovelly Park, and it's finished up a good looking plant. The building was new and looked good. The office was very neat and tidy, and we were set up very nicely, making money. So, but we were growing at a hell of a speed, and we were growing faster than you could generate cash for the profit. So Langman said, let's take it public. Initial public offering. 1966 this was, we went public, got a lot of new capital. And then we bought new machines, and we bought a 4-spindle German Kruger copying lathe for making the stocks. And that really revolutionised the stock business. You'd make 4 in 12 minutes on the Kruger and didn't need much sanding. We were developing the rifle and shotgun product line, and and Fred Gray was the engineer that did the detailed design work, but the prototypes had to be built, and you had to build them and perfect them and you'd probably build 6 prototypes before you got what you wanted, particularly on the woodwork. And the woodwork was something you could change, and you could bring out a new model just by changing the woodwork. Well, Miller was a very, very capable stock maker on woodwork, very detailed. He could do the checkering and everything. And he worked for Gray making the prototypes mainly. So here we are, a public company with an adequate capital, no more cash worries, And we thought we needed to get out the rifle business a bit diversified, because we was legislation. They're going to legislate you out of business. Everybody would say, hey, you're only going to be around for another 10 years. They're going to ban rifles altogether. They're going to ban rifles altogether. Langman and I believed it. So Ramshead had just got going in Australia with those fastening tools and were doing pretty good. And I thought, why wouldn't we get into the industrial guns, get out of the sporting field? They're never going to ban those things. And we were in pretty good shape with the bank. And the bank had a foreign service where they would do a survey for any of their customers. We want to get a manufacturing license to get the technology to make these fastening guns. We don't need the technology so much to make the gun. We can do that ourselves. We can reverse copy one of these things like we did the Springfield. But the fasteners, the technology of the fasteners, how do you heat treat? How do you make them and what have you? So they did the survey, and they came back and they said, well, there's 3 manufacturers in the United States. There's Remington, and there's Omark Industries in Portland, Oregon, and there's Winchester. But Winchester already have a licensee. I wrote to Remington and I wrote to Omark Industries, got a letter back from John Gray, nice letter, said, we're very interested in your proposition and the fact that you are rifle manufacturers, and we would be interested in discussing with you a possibility of a manufacturing license, exclusive manufacturing license for Australia. Remington wrote back and said, thank you for your letter, but we are not interested. 3 lines. I wrote to John Gray, who's the owner. He owned Omark Industries at the time, owned it lock, stock and barrel. And he had 75% of the world market for saw chain, 75% of the world market for saw chain, with a 65% gross margin, making money like a bandit. Got on an aeroplane and come over here in 1957, and never been out of Australia before. And in those days, 1957, the difference between the culture here in the United States and the culture in Australia, this was like going to the moon. I got off in San Francisco, I wondered where the heck I was. Anyway, I got up here to Portland and rolled up to Gray 9 o'clock one morning, and I got the royal treatment. So I got on very well with Gray. And he said, how long are you going to stay? Well, I said, depends whether you're going to give me a license or not. If I'm going to get the license, I'll stay and I'll spend some time in the plant and get all the drawings and what have you. He said, well, I got a house down at the coast. He said, I got a beach house at the coast. Sunday afternoon, Gray says, well, I've made up my mind, Jack. I'm going to give you a manufacturing license. We will give you everything, every technical help we can. Give you all the drawings. You can spend as much time in our plants as you want. You can study what we're doing. But we want 5% of royalty. So I went home happy as could be. Tom Playford.
Yeah.
Tom Playford did more good for South Australia than anybody else ever, or up to date either. He was 100% for establishing big industry in South Australia. Any industry that would employ people, he was for it. He helped enormously to open doors for us and what have you. And when we built Clovelly Park, he helped with the financing of it. You know, and then when we built the big plant down at West Beach, you know, the government paid for that building. Yep. And we paid it off eventually, but they put up the money and it was very beneficial to South Australia. The guy was a wonderful man. And he came and visited several times, and he was very encouraging, and you could talk to him anytime. And so there wasn't coming from the South Australia government, it was coming from the clowns in Canberra. And Fred Gray, I worked for Fred Gray at Omark Industries. He was, not Omark, Arrow Motors, when we were doing the gas producers. And he was the foreman there. Fred was a good, tough boss, and we got him for that. But actually he came there as a replacement for Max Peterson. Max was better than him. Max was a machine shop guy. Fred Gray was a mechanic. So there was a lot of difference. Fred Gray had a very keen interest in rifles, had a great ability to think out complex mechanisms and so forth. And so I made him chief engineer in charge of rifle development. We had an engineering shop with 3 or 4 draftsmen, and Fred was the practical guy that was in charge and decided what the designs were. He and I would sit down and figure out what we were going to do, and then Fred would put it into practice, and then the tool and die shop would make the prototypes. And Ted Hansen, the guy in the picture, Handshine, his father was a Swiss, and his father was a brilliant machinist, tool and die man. And Ted had a natural bent for it. He could make anything. And he'd make tools and equipment and jigs and fixtures for the factory half the time anybody else could. He was the best man that company ever had. Month after month, year after year, when we had the 22s perfected, we were making 1,500 rifles a month. I actually sold 25,000 to Winchester of the bolt action 22. Well, the Winchester guy, a Winchester vice president of marketing, came to Australia. They were interested in the ammunition business there and heard about us and called me and asked me could he come over to Adelaide and have a look at the plant. And he said, how about making some for Winchester and the Winchester brand? I said, sure. I did 2 trips back to Winchester, and they sent a couple of technical guys out. We made a few alterations for Winchester. Winchester had a way of doing things and we had a way of doing things different. So we did that. And then we did the deal. I went over there, and finally I came away with an order for 25,000 of them. And we made them. And but Winchester was going broke, and it's still broke. Langman took over as CEO of the company when I came to the United States. Actually, I came over here first. John Gray had suggested to me I come over and manage the construction tool division. They were having big trouble with it. And obviously he was impressed by the way I'd set up to make the tools and got the pin stuff going. But prior to coming over here, I came over in 1960, and Gray said, how much does it cost you to build these tools? And I had all the cost data there, and he said, God, you make them for half the price we do. He said, well, we're selling them at a loss. We're losing, $20,000 a month on this division. He said, one of the reasons is the thing costs too much to make here in Portland. He said, how about making all the tools for us in Australia? This is before he bought the company. I came away with an order for 38,000 tools. That's how many they were selling in the United States. 1 year's supply. That was 3,000 tools a month. And they were much more expensive than a rifle. Oh, they were a lot harder to make than a rifle. So we went from doing 1,500 rifles to 1,500 rifles to 4,500. And we didn't have enough cash for it. But in addition to that, when I was here in 1960, not only did I go home with an order for 38,000 of these things, this is big business. You ought to see the smile on my face. It was 4 feet wide. Anyway, I get the sole distribution rights for Australia. So that's when we decided to go public. We needed the money we needed new cash to do the chain business. It was a lot of money. And our fastener business was giving rams out of hiding, and we had these 5 distribution centres, and we had, like 50 salesmen out there selling that stuff. Langman said, why don't we go public? And that's when we went public, and Gray bought 26% of the stock. He said, hey, I want a piece of, when you go public, I want a decent piece of the company. He said, you got our distribution for chain, and I wanted them locked in anyway, and we're buying all our tools from you, we want a piece of it. And so he bought 26%, and the rest was sold. We had the sole distribution rights for Parker Hale. But Parker Hale were into the surplus firearms and surplus ammunition thing in England. John LeBreton, the chief operating officer there, was a friend of mine. So we were selling millions of rounds of .303. We'd ship it in from England, add 40% and sell it. We were selling Sportco rifles to all the big distributors, and they were just crying for this cheap .303 ammunition. So we said to Holmes, who was loading it, he was making the whole thing, loaded ammunition, not just the projectile, he was making the loaded ammunition. We said, why don't we buy it, we pack it in Sportco boxes, and we'll act as like a manufacturer's rep. You make it and pack it and call it Sportco and sell it to us. So we sold the reloaded ammunition. We had the sole distribution rights for Dynamit Noble in Germany. And we sold it to all the target shooters, that stuff, and we had a 40% margin on that. That was good. We imported that stuff from Germany, and we were importing all this stuff from England, and Holmes was making the ammunition. So we were not manufacturing anything, we were distributing it. Because we had the cash, we could give the credit, and we had the cash to buy it with and what have you. So it was nice business. And it went very well with the barrels, because the barrel business in Australia was good always. While we had the gun business there, we had a very good barrel business. We made barrels for Mausers, and we made barrels for Mausers as well as because they were importing a lot of surplus, ex-military German rifles into the country, and they were a hell of a lot better than the old Springfield, because the old Lee-Enfield, because it had a rimless cartridge. And then we were buying 30 caliber cases in America, shipping them to Adelaide, and then having Holmesy load them for the Mausers. Boy, that was good business too. So we had a pretty diversified business. We didn't sell to retail stores in Australia at all. We didn't sell a firearm product line, barrels or ammunition or the guns direct to the dealers. We sold it through wholesalers, maybe 4 or 5 wholesalers in each city, and Don Fleetwood and Sporting Goods distributors were a very important Adelaide customer. And in the early days, Don was getting started and we were getting started, and we were in the same street. So Don wanted something blued, he'd come down and get it blued and wait while we did it. And if we needed some cash to meet the payroll, we'd deliver him 12 rifles and have him pay us cash and so forth. So we were working together very well. It was a very good working relationship and a very friendly relationship. And Jackie was a tremendous asset there. She was very knowledgeable and very good with the customers and very popular. And she sold a lot of Sportco rifles, right? So we had a very nice relationship, and it was, half a mile away. When we went down to Clovelly Park, we had a lot more capability, and we could do all sorts of stuff that helped our customers big time. John Stewart was a very experienced sales manager type, and he worked, when we first sold rifles, we sold through a manufacturer's rep, and Stewart was a sales manager for them, and they sold all kinds of little stuff to the wholesalers. So the rifles, except for Adelaide, went through them, and we did it mainly for cash reasons. The manufacturer's rep had some money and they could pay us quickly, and that was important too when you're growing fast and needed cash. But once we got cash in the bank, we didn't need that 10% commission, so we decided we'd sell direct. So we fired the manufacturer's rep and we stole his sales manager. And he and Langman didn't get on at all. I got on with him, but Langman didn't like the way he behaved, so he and Langman used to get to it a bit. But Langman, once I left there, Langman fired him. Well, it's the most fun industry in the world, But the thing that I didn't realise until after I'd been here in the United States for a while, that what really got me into the gun business was the evolution of the reloading of ammunition by shooting. After World War II, everybody, both in the United States and Australia, came back with a rifle. So it started a completely new industry. So a whole bunch of people cropped up over here. Dick Spear started making primers up in Lewiston, Idaho. And Vernon Spear, his brother, had a separate setup, made the projectiles. Fred Huntington made the presses and the dies. And they dominated the market, and so did Spear, and so did Dick Spear with the bullets. So I came over to the States to manage the construction tool division, and we were buying our cartridges from Winchester. So I said to the president, I said, hey, we got to make our own cartridges. There's no way we can succeed in this business if we can get jerked around by Winchester. What about CCI? What about Dick Spear? You think we could buy him out and put some dough in it and make our own cartridges? He said, good idea, Jack, good idea. He said, let's go up and see him. They had a guy up there by the name of Arlen Cheney. He was just out of the army. He was a captain out of the army, and Arlen was the sales manager. And Arlen said, hey, he said, we can make this stuff. He said, all we need is some money. And I said, well, we can provide the money, but we want to own it. He said, well, he thinks Dick might take some money. So Arlen finished up being the president of that division, So I came back to Portland, and we kicked it around at the management group and what have you. And we had a consulting firm, the Boston Consulting Group. And we got them in to show us how we could diversify away from being saw chain. I said, well, you've got to get into an emerging market, and you've got to be big enough to be the dominant player. And dominance means you've got to be 1.5 times the size of your nearest competitor to be dominant. So I said, I know one business you could be dominant in, and that's the reloading business. The big three don't want to be in it. It's fragmented now. So-and-so makes the barrels, Dick Spear makes the primers, Vern Spear makes the projectiles, Fred Huntington makes the presses and the dies. Let's put them all together. So within 2 years, I'd bought all of them. Bought CCI first, and then Fern and Spear, then we bought Huntington. Anyway, that gave us pretty well control over all the components, the presses, the dies, the projectiles, and the primers and what have you, for the reloading industry worldwide. Started off with a $2 million investment into CCI, gave us the power loads for the construction fasteners, and then Cheney and I developed a plan to sell the 22s nationwide, and it boomed and went like this. Is before the Koreans got into it, and we took 25% of the 22 business in 5 years. We drove it from the $2 million acquisition to $110 million in 10 years. It was a fantastically profitable business too. There would be product liability big time in the ammunition business, but there was never had a suit ever. Never had a suit on rifles ever either. No product liability, but on the tools, the fastening business big time. And then of course, having Sportco, Greg came over here and he got a degree in economics in the University of Adelaide, came over here, wanted to go to school, so we sent him to the MBA program up in University of Washington up in Seattle. I had the money to fund him into starting Kimber. I have a natural engineering bent, and I have a natural aptitude for running factories, and I love manufacturing. I did a lot of shooting in Australia because I had to. I was in the gun business, and you have to take the writers out on hunting trips, and you have to take your customers out on hunting trips and what have you. So it was a public relations reason I went hunting. And then, of course, I got into manufacturing ammunition here in the United States. So at Sportco, I learned how to make rifles and successfully made firearms, shotguns, and no pistols, of course. Then I came over here and started making ammunition. And we went from a $2 million acquisition to a $110 million ammunition business. So we made a pistol ammunition, centerfire pistol ammunition out of aluminum wire. We bought it in coils, half-inch diameter aluminum wire, fed it into a 4-blow cold header, and we made them at 500 strokes a minute. We had cartridge cases flying out of that machine at 500 strokes a minute, and we spent $1.5 million on developmental expenses to get it perfected. Once again, we had 50% gross margin in it, and we made it so they couldn't reload it. Not that it couldn't be. If we'd have put a center primer like the American ammunition, you could reload it easily. I loved it. Then when I come over here, I had on a scale, we had a $300 million company for 5,000 people, 14 plants, and I'm in charge of the whole day-to-day operations. You could have a fun job, I tell you. It took me 4 years to get control of the whole thing, but I tell you what, it was fun.